Do you want to talk about some Black American classicism? Because I sure do. So here it is. Beginning with the Italian Renaissance and continuing into the Enlightenment and up through today, a rediscovery of the classical West, meaning in this context, ancient Greece and Rome, has been a significant undercurrent in politics and cultures in Europe, and eventually the United States. As a study, it has been used in the creation of white identity. This is the origin of Western ideals. While the field of classics can be manipulated towards the goals of white supremacy, here I want to take time to acknowledge the ways in which Black American classicists and authors have used classical allusions and discussions within their works in order to deconstruct white supremacy and work through Black American identity for the purposes of abolitionment and desegregation. I will begin by surveying some of the most important aspects of Black American classicism as necessary background, and then we will zero in on some landmark pieces of Black literature where these allusions are present and discuss how the authors of such works use these to serve their work's overall argument. Finally, we will conclude with some complications and discussions of Black classicism today. Classics as a field of study is heavily focused on the philology of Greek and Latin, meaning it is largely concerned with the development and usage of these languages to produce literary culture, things like epics, poems, oratorial speeches, etc., and what those can tell us about the people from which they come. It is important to understand that while these cultures did exhibit their own social hierarchies, the idea of these ancient societies as some kind of beacon of civilization and European exceptionalism is incredibly fraught. Particularly, their association with whiteness as we understand it today is entirely a product of the colonial period and has been extrapolated upon up through today. This is relevant because it completely topples the idea of a pure, unbroken through line from ancient Greece and Rome to the modern West. And often those hierarchies and structures are misrepresented in service of white supremacy. In fact, during the Middle Ages, much of the European world did not really concern itself with classical antiquity. It is largely thanks to the Arabic-speaking world that many of those classical texts still survive to this day. The rediscovery of classical antiquity in Europe is what defines the European Renaissance, which did not begin until the 14th century in Italy and progressed to other parts of Europe later, which I say to cement that the understanding that there has been some direct lineage between classical antiquity and the modern civilized European world is just not true. In the antebellum United States, or a moment in American history after the War of 1812, before the Civil War, many abolitionists and African American scholars were also very much invested in what could be gleaned from the classical period. In fact, many abolitionist texts and slave narratives such as Clotel or The President's Daughter by William Wells Brown employ classical allusions and scholarship within their narratives to highlight the hypocrisy of the United States in its employment of Enlightenment and classical ideals. When we get to W.E.B. Du Bois's Dark Water in 1920, we see how this discussion is elaborated on further as significant portions of the text contend with classics and Black liberation. In this video, though, we will be focusing on form regarding this text in particular. Of course, though, this work towards Black liberation was mostly deconstructive in nature, as the court du jour of white people who were invested in the study of classics was to find ways to use it to uphold white supremacy. While I could, and I do intend to discuss this in more detail later, it is evident in the material culture and remnants of slavery. Need I say more when so many plantation houses are built in a neoclassical style, when Doric columns were such a staple in antebellum architecture? I will, but later. It is important to understand that the divorce of higher education and the study of classics as being inherently synonymous is rather new. While classical education never really disappeared in its entirety, well into the 20th century, classical education, and particularly philological immersion in Latin and Greek, was the de facto state of higher education, meaning that as soon as there were African Americans entering institutions of higher education, there were Black American classical scholars. On the significant increase of historically Black colleges and institutions, or HBCUs, opening immediately post-Civil War, Dr. Rankine, professor of classics at UChicago, writes, "Within this landscape, the Department of Classics would have struck a minor, albeit important, historically chord. The major chord had been the uplift of Black people in the US and to some extent globally, within the framework of classical Western humanism. Black leaders in the 19th and early 20th centuries believed that classics were their own, citing Egypt and ancient African accomplishments as their lineage. As a concept, the West might be even more fraught in the 21st century than it was at the apogee in the late 19th century. Which is to help us understand that while still part of a codified and white-centric higher education system, if the giant leap for mankind was the Union victory over the South in the Civil War and the liberation of Black people, the mere presence of Black individuals in this field and others available at institutions of higher learning was Neil Armstrong's small step for a man. Or if you prefer more explicitly stated points, the educational structures in the US were not resolved at the point of emancipation. Thus, the access to those structures at the very least allowed Black individuals much more opportunity for self-actualization than previously afforded to them." Rankine also goes on to discuss how Howard University, an HBCU founded in 1867, still emphasizes in its mission statement the importance of educational opportunities for Black students, which at the time included a classics department. But we will revisit that later. Rankine is writing in 2020, so just to be sure, I checked the website and this is still included in their mission statement as of December 2023. Rankine also discusses how the usage of classics in Black education in the 19th century was a full-on discourse in its own right. Du Bois arguing for classical humanism as essential to the edification of people formerly deemed property, Washington, as in Booker T of Tuskegee University's position that technical training was the best lifeline for the formerly enslaved Black masses, had at its end the best interests of the same, not the abstract question about the best form of education everywhere and always. One of the most influential Black classical scholars who comes to mind immediately is a man named William Sanders Scarborough, who, according to Rutgers' database of classical scholars, was born enslaved in 1852 in Georgia. He studied at several prestigious universities, including Atlanta University, Oberlin College, Liberia College, State University of Louisville, and Morrison Brown College, which is to say, when it comes to educational experience, this man is stacked. As far as his professional career is concerned, he was initially a high school Latin teacher at Lewis High School, and through his career as a professor who taught ancient languages at Wilberforce University, which he later became the president of, he authored a few important books for the field, one called First Lessons in Greek in 1881 and Questions of Latin Grammar in 1887. He also wrote another called The Birds of Aristophanes, a Theory of Interpretation. He was also the first African-American person to join the MLA and the third to join the APA. He also, at one point, was a research consultant for the Bureau of Economics and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He also helped found the NAACP. These are only some of his accomplishments, as he is somebody worthy of his own video entirely, but more so to give you a window view into the significant role Black classicists played in Black liberation. So as we examine the literature, we can come to understand it as just one focal point within a larger discussion within Black scholarship. Classics as a study is enlightened by having Black classical scholarship within it and debating the ramifications of it. The contributions of these individuals are inextricable to the field despite the claims of anyone in the past or present. Conversely, when it comes to the advancement of education access for POC, whether you agree with Du Bois or Washington, Black classicists were among those at the forefront of the fight. But as with everything else, white supremacy even further complicates the discussion of where classics stands as it pertains to Black liberation. Of course, though, it is not all sunshine and roses in the field of classics. And I would be the last person to try to paint that picture. You may have noticed how often I have used air quotes when speaking, and that is because, as Selena Gomez would say, everything is not what it seems. In the introduction of Empire of Ruin by John Levy Barnard, professor of English and Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, while citing fellow scholar Seth Sheen, he writes, "The classical is and always has been ideological, deriving its force not purely from its relation to a real or imagined past, but in part from its relation to current social, political, and moral values that it helps to legitimate. Thus, it is easy to see how, as poignantly as African Americans have oriented classics towards racial liberation and activism, white supremacist classical scholars have molded the study of classics to suit their own ends." According to PhD student of the humanities at Faulkner University, David Whitehoun's article, African Americans and the Classics, an Introduction, as Nell Irvin Painter points out in The History of White People, white claims of inheritance and knowledge of classical culture were a prominent feature in the development of a racial hierarchy that shoved people of color to the bottom. Even today, white supremacist groups and individuals use the classics to bolster their cause by touting Greco-Roman culture as a facet of white identity. One such group recently placed flyers in public spaces on college campuses featuring images of classical art overlaid with slogans of white supremacy. We are still dealing with the ramifications of white supremacy in classics today, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. After reading this in Whitehoun's article, I decided to pick up the history of white people for myself. The author, Nell Irvin Painter, is a historian and artist who is now retired from Princeton University. The first two chapters of his book were immensely important to my research here. Chapter 1 of History of White People is titled Greeks and Scythians, and offers quite a bit of enlightening information on early Greeks. According to Painter, the sophisticated Egyptian, Phoenician, Minoan, and Persian societies deeply influenced the classical culture of ancient Greece, which some still imagine as the West's pure and unique source. He also discusses in this chapter ways in which modern concepts of race and the ways they have been applied to Greeks are fraught. He discusses how Scythians and Celts were designated to far distant barbarians, and that ancient Greeks did not think in terms of race, and how later translators projected modern ideas of race into their translations of these works, which permanently changed the connotations of these works thereafter. Painter even takes some time to discuss Hippocrates' Greek-centric views, even at the expense of other peoples we would think of as European today, essentially deconstructing the idea of perfect homogeneous Europeanness. In this chapter, Painter also talks about how slavery for ancient Greeks often looked different than how the American consciousness would picture enslavement. It was not based on race, and the slave class largely consisted of people conquered by the Greeks. If we looked at those people today, they would comprise of all different phenotypes that we associate with different races today. Here, he gives the example of the enslaved Scythian police force in Athens and discusses that while slavery was often very incredibly violent in the ancient world, and any scholar would be remiss to deny this fact, there were often points in which there were real opportunities for manumission and upwards mobility that there really were not for enslaved Black Americans at any point. Chapter 2, Romans, Celts, Gauls, and Germani, focuses on deconstructing views of race in Rome. In fact, early on in this chapter, Painter discusses how, as imperial power shifted west from Greece to Rome, so did the dominant culture's view of barbarians, and Celts and Gauls and Germani began to become defined. Perhaps we can see this as an early example of a shift in identity-based lines. In discussing Roman views of Gaul, Painter writes, "Clearly to the Romans, civilization, not blood, set the two peoples apart," which is to say that Romans saw cultural differences as the main marker of in-group versus out-group, rather than skin color. As Painter points out, when Caesar wrote, "Gauls are impressive and sudden in their decision-making, Gauls are very tall and hold our slighter build in contempt," he was not being complimentary. While he did make note of feature-based differences, he is more than anything remarking on the prowess of the Roman army in defeating them, because despite this physical difference, he conquered the Gauls. In the 19th century, when race talk ruled, his descriptions of the Germani served theorists searching for immutable Teutonic traits. Painter also elaborates on how these same 19th century race fanatics clearly ignored inconvenient aspects of early Germans. For example, how it was the women who were soothsayers who decided when they would wage war, and how they would accompany the men to the battlefield with their children, essentially to cheer them on. This is all to say that, as we discussed prior, while the academic idea of classics is often consolidated into an idea of Greece and Rome, the foregrounding of Western civilization, this is fraught at best. In fact, modern scholars agree that this is flawed. Much of the work that has been done by Black classicists, writers, theorists, historians, etc., that has been centered around classics as a study that belongs to them just as much as white people, not just as inheritors of Enlightenment thought, but also expanding to Africans of the ancient world, as well as the fact that oftentimes these claims to immutable white supremacy are often derived from a purposeful warping of the reality of the ancient world. In fact, while I will not be doing a deeper dive into this text here, it would be worthwhile to mention something of an example of this that I have read when it comes to early Black American literature. The Blind African Slave, as told by Jeffrey Brace to Benjamin F. Prentice, who transcribed the narrative. Brace, having been born in Africa and then enslaved in the US and then fighting in the Revolutionary War, tells a harrowing story of his hardships as an enslaved man. He spends significant portions of the text at the beginning discussing the political and social structures of his kingdom, Bawu. He also talks significantly of the interactions between the Romans and ancient Africans. Brace cites how the land where Bawu is now found was thought of by the Romans as the garden of the world. Just one way in which Brace speaks of the interactions between Romans and Africans in a way that is almost anti-racist. He is pointing out how the racial divisions that exist today did not exist during that time, and instead there was, at least at times, positive interactions that could be fostered between Romans and Africans. Venturing back to Barnard's Empire of Ruin, Chapter 3, Charles Chesnutt and the Sites of Memory, Barnard gives a prescient account of the way Black authors use classics within literature in the 19th and 20th centuries by evoking author and political activist Charles Chesnutt's satirical usage of classics and his experiences with the classics in a white supremacist culture. Quickly, if you are unaware, Charles Chesnutt is an important figure in Black American history, not only for his activism and literature, but also as a huge critic of the expectation of passing, especially as someone who openly identified as Black even though he was only 1/8 Black. He dedicated himself to Black liberation when he easily could have ignored the issue and passed for white. Barnard frames this chapter with a trip Chesnutt took to the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. He notes Chesnutt's initial awe at the site, having written about it that it is worthy to be the capital of a great nation. Barnard discusses some important pieces of artwork that Chestnut would have encountered while visiting the Capitol, particularly the fresco adorning the interior of the Rotunda, Constantino Brumitti's The Apotheosis of Washington, commissioned in 1865. An image that is a clear example of the classical historical concept of translatio imperii, according to which the seat of empire moved inexorably westward, from Rome in the predominantly American conception to London and then the New World. Thus, the image of Washington as experiencing an apotheosis, that is, an ascension to godhood, is clearly meant to cement a connection to, if not directly conflate, the US with being the modern bearers of a classical legacy, and the Capitol is full of artwork within this vein. With regards to Chestnut's writing on the fresco, Barnard continues, he foregoes appreciation in favor of noting potent irony. To summarize, that irony is the fact that the painting only is so majestic from afar, as you're meant to view it from the ground, and as you get closer to it, much like in the real history, the figures are grotesque and ill-proportioned. Barnard continues with how this sort of picking at the thread of irony in Chestnut's work came more to fruition, providing the example of Chestnut's The Origin of the Hatchet Story, published by Puck magazine in April 1889, where he depicts Washington as the spoiled son of an Egyptian pharaoh who enjoys mutilating his slaves for fun. And this would not be the only time Chestnut would use references to the ancient world to satirize Washington, as he later does it again in A Roman Antique, published in 1889. There are a few more important observations that Barnard makes that I want to make note of before moving on. He writes, from Phyllis Wheatley's ironic version of classical typologies to William Wells Brown's reframing of the American architecture of freedom and democracy as architecture of slavery and empire, indicate a long-standing pattern of contestation at the sites of memory. The simultaneous presence of the aging Brumitti working away and the young Chestnut observing and remarking on the distortions inherent in this kind of work presents a compelling image for this historiographical context. To elaborate, as Barnard discusses this reversal of the meaning of classical history and iconography for the contemporary American context, recalls one of the critical methods of Black classicism that prevailed, explaining how the deconstruction of white supremacy has been a significant portion of Black classicism in the US and how incredibly salient it can be. We will now be looking at a few more poignant examples of this. According to scholar of African American literature Robert S. Levine, whose second edition of William Wells Brown's Clotel, or The President's Daughter, A Narrative of Slave Life in the United States, which is the edition of the text I have read for this video, Clotel is a landmark work, the first novel by an African American. Notably, the novel was published while Brown was still considered an escaped slave. So when it is said that this is an early and notable work, this is very much the case. I have also selected this work so we can see just how early in the game Black Americans were using classics to deconstruct whiteness through literature. The novel follows the life stories of Clotel, her sister Althesia, and their mother Currer, who is Thomas Jefferson's mistress, making Clotel and Althesia his biological daughters, and it follows their children as well. Clotel is wonderfully sardonic in asking white America to contemplate how the daughters of Thomas Jefferson, someone who to white America is symbolic of American values and freedom, could be enslaved and sold into sexual exploitation, as well as having their domestic labor exploited. And further, how their mostly genealogically white daughters could suffer so much pain and strife at the hands of white America, socialization, and systems of enslavement. Within the text of Clotel, in chapter 20, A True Democrat, we are introduced to a young doctor named Henry Morton, who, while visiting the home she is enslaved at in Vermont, meets Althesia. When meeting her, he, a northerner who had previously little direct interaction with slavery, is taken aback by seeing a teenage girl being enslaved who to him presents as white. Morton later purchases and marries Althesia and moves with her to New Orleans, where she passes for white. In this chapter, Morton, whom the narrative notes did not publicly advocate for abolition, made himself obnoxious in private circles, condemning the peculiar institution. Like any hip, young, educated man of his time, he begins by discussing the despotism of Rome under Nero and later the Triumvirate. Morton seems to understand oppression as something of an equation. That the more tyrants there are inflicting pain upon the oppressed, the higher the amount of pain each oppressed person must endure. Explaining how because there are more white people than black people, they must endure a disproportionate amount of ire. He later returns to this line of thought, explaining how Rome lost her national character, that is to say, her values, and her destruction followed. In his rant, Morton also alludes to popular texts that are contemporary with him. He, at one point, references the clear white of Caucasian tribes and the swarthy Ethiopian, which the footnotes of the text contribute to the text On the Natural Varieties of Mankind by German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Morton also quotes Black nationalist David Walker, "The slaves of Athens and Rome were free in comparison to Black slaves in the Americas. They had some rights, could acquire some property, could choose their own masters." While I would argue here that this is true in some cases, the brutality directed towards and rights of ancient enslaved people varied too much for blanket statements like this. Otherwise, though, these are seemingly overall salient points made by Dr. Morton. I mean, to lend him some credence, Empire of Ruin does state that some people viewed ancient Rome as a precedent that justified social stratification. Even though I would once again stress that the social stratification did not look the way white supremacists made it out to. However, on some of the racial science cited by Morton, it is important to clarify, as Painter points out in the introduction of The History of White People, slavery has helped construct concepts of the white race. American tradition equates whiteness with freedom while consigning blackness to slavery. The history of unfree white people slumbers in popular forgetfulness, though white slavery, like black slavery, moved people around and mixed up human genes on a massive scale. Which is to say, on top of all that we have already discussed, racial lines are by no means discrete and are completely arbitrary. Ultimately, though, this chapter operates as a mockery of Henry Morton and the sort of abolitionists he is a caricature of. Those who not only are abolitionists because of personal investment in the issue, if they are white, but who understand the liberation of enslaved people to be based on their potential towards a proximity to whiteness, and not necessarily because of the merit or value Black individuals hold as human beings. This is evident in the title of this chapter, A True Democrat, a title which is completely facetious on Brown's part, as Morton's ideals of democracy are half-baked and still based on ideas of racial hierarchy steeped in desire towards Western exceptionalism, or as discussed earlier, translatio imperi. There's your $5 term for the day. Another example of this kind of juxtaposition when it comes to Morton within Quotel is in Chapter 9, The Man of the Honor, in which it is written, Dr. Morton soon obtained a large practice in his profession, and with it increased in wealth. But with all his wealth, he would never own a slave. Mrs. Morton was now in a position to seek out and redeem her mother. Brown points out this hypocrisy so clearly when he discusses Morton's vow of never owning a slave, and then mentions his wife in the next sentence. By law, she is his slave. Whether he sees it that way or not, she will be beholden to him in a way that a free woman would not. Even his marriage is ultimately built on the institution of slavery in the most visceral way possible. Morton's hypocrisy is potent. We really see the deconstructive nature of the use of classical allusions within literature come to ultimate form in W.E.B. Du Bois's Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil. Threaded through the entire text are fascinating discussions that either directly evoke or allude to classics. While there is plenty of textual evidence that can be used in service of my thesis here, this text also provides us a unique opportunity to examine form as a means of allusion and deconstruction. In the postscript, Du Bois writes on the form he chose to set the work in. Between the sterner flights of logic, I have sought to set some little lightings of what may be poetry. That is to say that the form this work takes is an entangled yet cohesive work in which each individual chapter's ideas often build on the previous ones but do not always take the same form. Many of the chapters are in prose, but many are also in poetry. Whether purposefully or by coincidence, I could not help thinking in a sort of bare-bones way this as resembling the form of Plato's Republic. The characters within the Republic quote fragments of poetry in order to better express their points. It is true that often Du Bois's verse seems to be an alternative expression of the prose preceding it, which is all over classical discourse. Du Bois continues, "The pieces of verse are tributes to beauty, unworthy to stand alone, yet perversely in my mind, now at the end, I know not whether I mean the thought for the fancy or the fancy for the thought, or why the book trails off to playing rather than standing strong on unanswering fact. But this is always, is it not, the riddle of life." I love that. Chef's kiss. While the capital B, beauty, continues to highlight some of the Platonic aspects of his postscript, the overall discussion comes off as very Aristotelian. In David Gallup's Poetry versus History and Aristotle's Poetics, he summarizes the Aristotelian dichromatic view of what Aristotle referred to as poetry and history, or in this case, verse and prose. For Aristotle, history speaks of particulars, whereas poetry speaks more of universals. Poetry is therefore more philosophical and more elevated than history. In Chapter 2 of Dark Water, The Souls of White Folk, Du Bois takes time to deconstruct the soul of whiteness through something of a facetious historical analysis, much of which, when matched up with texts such as the history of white people, is still clearly very salient today. He writes, "Neither Roman nor Arab, Greek nor Egyptian, Persian nor mongrel ever took himself and his own perfectness with such disconcerting seriousness as the modern white man, clearly poking fun at the idea that white people take their identity as white individuals as something so incredibly definite and defining in a way that basically has never been seen before." Du Bois's following section, The Riddle of the Sphinx, is his first piece of verse within the book. The title itself is a reference to the mythological character of the Sphinx, who is usually guarding some kind of doorway, originally from Egypt but later present in Greek literature, who gave passers-by incredibly difficult riddles that they had to solve to gain access or be eaten by the Sphinx. In giving the piece this title, he lets us know immediately that the riddle of white supremacy is nonsensical but also has incredibly high stakes. Connecting this section of his verse, "Who raised the fools to their glory, but black men of Egypt and Ind, Ethiopia's sons of the evening, Indians and yellow Chinese, Arabian children of morning, and the mongrels of Rome and Greece," recalls the previous chapter's discussion of how seriously the white man takes himself. We come to understand that the reason the white man must take himself so seriously is because the structures created around that identity rely on using it as a barrier which sections people of color off for exploitation in service of the white man. Today, while not the sole focus of higher education, classics is still very much a part of it. Depending on who you ask, though, classics may be dying out. Though, according to others, the field is just changing, evolving even. Rankine gives us some vignettes into what this discourse on the topic looks like at different universities. Even at institutions where there is not a department of classics, as is the case at Purdue University, where Rankine taught for 15 years, the cultural discourse around the value of classics is ubiquitous. Local realities, including college and university cultures and values, dictate that classics do not ever denote an abstract departmental set of norms. Rather, classics departments are, to a tangible degree, specific. The discipline itself inflected in local culture. On why, as a Black man, Rankine chooses to study classics, he writes, "Representation is itself a pathway, occasioning new questions and focal points, different concerns and approaches." Within the article, Rankine also discusses the controversy sparked when HBCU, Howard University, decided to permanently close its classics department. He writes, "Howard University foregrounds the evolving meaning of the classical at institutions of higher education in the US and the relationship of this meaning to other cultural sites of significance, including race and Blackness, the humanities, and Western or non-Western discourse." Rankine also notes that Howard University stands apart among colleges and universities that offer Greco-Roman classics in requiring students to study African philosophy alongside those Western offerings. This requirement serves as the beginning of a corrective to the Blackened personhood that Western civilization created. He describes how some, particularly those devastated by the closure, because they believe classics to be integral to higher education, will make claims to the universality of classics. However, Rankine reminds us of omnilocalism, which is the idea that any claims to universalism within a specific setting, any purported universalism of classics, confronts the local concerns of given persons, groups, or institutions. While he does not wish to decide once and for all what the correct take is here, he does urge us to understand that with the structures of higher education as they are, Greek and Roman classics are unlikely to disappear entirely, and there will always be room for scholarship in the area. And what seems to be really happening here is merely a decentralization of them. While academics debate the future of classics, Painter's introduction concludes with the reminder that although science today denies race any standing as objective truth, the US Census faces taxonomic meltdown. Many Americans cling to race as the unschooled cling to superstition. So long as racial discrimination remains a fact of life and statistics can be arranged to support racial difference, the American belief in races will endure. But confronted with the actually existing American population, its distribution of wealth, power, and beauty, the notion of American whiteness will continue to evolve, as it has since the creation of the American Republic. This is to say that we are very much still dealing with the ramifications of American colonial racism and translatio imperii, today inside and outside academia. In the end, we come to understand that the field of classics and decentralization of Greek and Roman classics within culture and academia is a multi-edged sword. It is a study largely associated with Western and white supremacy, but in its own weird and wonderful way has also been used by Black authors, scholars, and classicists in order to deconstruct those systems, operating as something of a common sandbox at times to further cement arguments in favor of liberation in a colloquial sense, but also in itself is often deconstructed as a concept such that we come to understand that by no means do Greece and Rome stand as objective and alone.